All right, hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for opening up the video. We are going to talk a little bit about this KX500 project. That was a picture when I first got her. And what I discovered was that the crank bearings were loose or something was going on with the crank, and I had the motor worked on. The previous builder, this is a picture of kind of what I was just noticing with some of the sealant keeping the two case halves together. It wasn't the Bond stuff. It was real kind of flaky and would pull apart. So I just said, I got to figure this out. But what was going on was the crank bearings were loose, even with new crank bearings. And I had to then decide, all right, I'm going to do this myself. So this is kind of my chronology of splitting the cases the first time. And one of the things I would say, you can see here I'm taking pictures of the ignition timing, really specific as to, okay, where was it? What does it look like in the center? Because I knew the bike ran okay. We just had some issues with the bearing journals. If you've been following my story, these bearing journals get worn out. That's obviously the clutch. I literally was so anal, I put markings on the plate stack so I could kind of match it back up like a puzzle. Not that there was anything magical about that. But taking a lot of pictures makes a big difference. This is the top cap or pressure plate of the clutch. I wanted to get pictures of kind of how everything looked through the whole process. And you can do it yourself. You can if you get the right tools and you just be very deliberate. This is the clutch nut, which I later found out it is a lock nut, so you should replace that little brass looking one. This is the bearing, I guess, little bearing that goes behind the top cap. And here I am pulling out the clutch basket stack, the clutch stack, and just kind of getting pictures on video of how it looks. You've got, you start with the fiber, you end with the fiber, and you put a metal one in between. And, by doing that, it actually helped me to be very, very deliberate in my reassembly and more confident. So if you are disassembling it, these are some pretty decent pictures of what stuff looks like, and that was also real helpful for me. That's one of the reasons I'm posting them. Maybe it's boring, but if you've had to do it and you're like, man, what did that look like? That's the primary drive gear. There is a clip on that. This is, of course, that shift assembly. That's the Kickstarter. This is the push rod, and from what I can see, it's about the same on both ends. But I even went ahead and I marked the point that was going in versus the point that was going out, because again, I knew the bike ran good. We just had this really weird issue with the bearings and the bearing journal. So we had this play in the crank, but it had a brand new rebuilt crank. And so there was something with the journals. And thanks to Mike Weir and Tom Morgan for letting me know that the cases, the little journals where those bearings go in, it gets worn out. And you got to, unfortunately, rebuild those things and add a more robust bearing in there. So this is the kickstart mechanism. Just so you can see, it does wind. Now, interestingly, I don't know if I have pictures of this posted, but if you ever rebuild your Kickstarter, look for their two little markings. There are two little indents on the Kickstarter between the ratchet gear and also the shaft, and you have to line it up. So you can see also here primary gear. I think that says PG or something, or PR. I marked everything because, in addition to pictures, if there was something I could mark with a permanent marker, I was going to do it. I marked neutral as well. Now, I knew it was in neutral. I knew I wanted to keep it in neutral when I reassembled it, and later I realized it was that little point where, it's laying right in the middle of that little star. And this is the idler gear. This is the clip that keeps one of the transmission shafts in. You have to remove that to pull the shaft. So, after or before you split the cases, you want to remove that. Again, lots of pictures, lots of documentation. This was my first time rebuilding a bike. This looks like it's the primary drive gear. And again, just a lot of pictures. Here's me kind of looking at the clutch, kind of figuring out, okay, there's that clutch nut. It's a 20 millimeter. And once I pulled that off, I believe this is what I got to next. So actually, that's the crank. That's I pulled off the primary drive, and you've got this little insert, which is another gear that is pressed in there. That never comes off unless you try to take it off. But I wanted to make sure all of that was robust and that I had done it correctly. This was getting pictures of that little spring-mounted selector arm, if you will. Again, hadn't done this before. This is, I believe, we're looking at this little gear selector. I forget what you call it, but I wanted to mark exactly where everything was before I started taking parts off and flinging them everywhere. And also, I wanted to make note of where neutral was, and so I marked the case. I went with nail polish. This was something a good friend of mine told me to do. He's like, hey, use nail polish. Mark where everything is. If you know everything works and you know where neutral is, mark it, because you're probably going to be back in neutral when you reassemble. And so here I'm just like documenting, okay, I took off the nut. There's a washer behind a nut. And that's another piece of this is anytime you remove a washer or a part, look behind the nut, look behind the part, look behind the shaft. There could be a very thin and maybe even a rare washer, a washer or spacer sticking to that part because of oil residue. And you may not realize it may wind up on the shop floor lost, and then you don't know where it goes. Nothing worse than winding up with a bunch of parts and realizing you put the motor back together and you forgot a washer. So here I am, video of me from my phone pulling off this set of bearings. And then you can see there when you pull that off there, oh, there's another washer there. Look at that. Now, if I didn't know which way that washer went, and maybe there's sometimes on these washers there's a flat side and then there's a rounded side. And if you have a bike that's been running fine and you pull something off and you don't have a video of you doing it, you may be like, wait a minute, what side went where, or how did this look? So letting the camera run, being a little slow, really, really important. Saved me a lot during this rebuild. And as I said, I've done work on bikes, but never really wanted to ever split the cases on anything because I got a family. It's a lot of time and a lot of patience. We all kind of want to ride. But anyway, in this point, I was splitting the, getting everything off the clutch side. And I was just really looking at everything, how everything worked, trying to understand it. Looking at that gear selector, the scariest thing for me was the transmission. I was like, what would happen if I got everything back together and the transmission didn't work? So I really was just trying to make sure that I could understand, okay, where's neutral? How does this thing work? And I'm kind of talking myself through it. It's kind of goofy, but it's just one of those things, you may have to do to make sure you really know what's going on and you do it right. Now, one of the things I did, it's not shown in this video, but before I put the crank back in, I actually dropped the transmission together with the shift forks and everything else, and I tested the transmission with the two case halves together and lightly screwed the case halves together so they were, they were solid, and I made sure I could shift through the transmission. And then I zip tied some of the pieces together, and then I dropped the crank in there. So I knew my transmission was good. I didn't want to drop the crank, seal the cases, press fit the bearings on the crank, and then have a transmission problem, because then I'd have to take it all apart again anyway. And you don't want to be pushing that crank in and out and doing all that stuff. So here I am before I ever disassembled, and I was just trying to see, hey, how does this work? Because there's going to come a point when I've done all this and I've now put in the new crank, and I'm going to have to see how this works. And what I realized was that it's hard to shift through the gears when the motor's not running. There's not that vibration. There's not all that force and movement. So you can shift through them, but you really got to spin the shafts. You got to spin the dials, so to speak. Like the Wizard of Oz, like pulling all the strings, but it will shift. Now, what happened eventually is if I really had to torque down on it, that little nut or bolt, I should say, that was holding that shift star together, that eventually would get loose. So I could do a little. Here is the clip that's on the end of the transmission. There's two clips on that for you KX guys. There's one clip that keeps it from going back into the case, which is the one that you're seeing here. Then there's another clip that holds the idler gear on. Now this is the primary gear. You pull that off, and that's what you got. And again, you know, you look at the back of everything you pull off. Now in this case, I didn't see anything. There is a
looks like a
seal there. So I wanted to get a video of that, and was wondering, is that seal good? Is it bad? You know, all the things that you would do when you're doing kind of like a forensic review of your bike. Now here I had pulled the spring off for this shift tension mechanism, and pulled off the shift star as well. And I knew there was a little bitty pin, because I had seen videos of other people. That little silver thing, that was a little pin. And I was just seeing, okay, could this fit different ways? Like, there were 3 holes on the other side of that shift star, and I was like, man, what if I put this wrong? And then I realized that, no, that pin is actually bigger than the other holes on the shift star, so it can only go right there. It can't go anywhere else. And then the star that pushes into it, it's got one hole, only one hole that pin can fit into. So that was a bit reassuring. But nevertheless, I marked it with nail polish and blue paint. Now, this was scary because, you know, I had not done this before. So I got a lot of pictures of the shift forks and everything else. Now, that was the bearing you just saw kind of just dropping out of the case. That was why the crank was loose. This is the power valve, same kind of thing. Watched a ton of videos, got it together, cleaned it up. This is the part coming back from Tom Morgan. He rebuilt this, balanced it, and he also did a truing. These are the cases with the new bearings in there and the rebuilt journals. This is the head with the amazing decomp release. That's the balanced crank. Now you can see he's removing weight, adding weight, and this is the bike where it stands today. This is kind of just the cosmetic look. Motors on the bench, but this is it. So if you enjoyed the video and you liked it, or you want to just kind of follow along, or maybe you need to go back to the videos or pictures of some of the stuff to help you with your KX500 rebuild or any rebuild, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. And I appreciate you guys watching my little photo album of the first disassembly of the KX500.